A black entrepreneur boards his first-class flight after years of building a successful business. But when he hands over his ticket, the flight attendant tears it up without explanation. Humiliated in front of a crowd, she tells him he doesn't belong there. Just 15 minutes later, the tables turn, and what happens next sends shockwaves through the airline and the world. Stay with me, because this is a story that proves no one should ever underestimate someone based on appearances. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from and if stories like this inspire you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. It started as just another travel day, but it became so much more. The airport was alive with its usual symphony of movement. Rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the monotone of announcements echoing overhead. The air was thick with the hum of anticipation, a transient energy that only such places seem to hold. Martin Avery moved through the crowd with the kind of ease that came from experience. His steps deliberate but unhurried. He was a man who belonged. At least, he had earned the right to feel so. Dressed in a tailored suit, he approached the gate with his first-class ticket in hand. The card felt weighty, not because of its material but because of what it represented. Every mile of his journey to this point had been marked by battles fought and won. By doors that had been shut in his face only for him to push them open again. But no amount of success had erased the quiet reminders of where he came from. Or how often people still tried to send him back there. The gate was busy, a cluster of passengers waiting for their moment to board. Martin scanned the area, his sharp eyes noting the subtle choreography of airport life. To his left, a family with tired eyes and restless children. To his right, a businessman absorbed in his phone, tapping away as though the world beyond his screen barely existed. At the center of it all stood the flight attendant, a woman in her mid-40s with a crisp uniform and a gaze that could cut glass. She was efficient, brisk in her movements, yet something in her demeanor shifted as Martin approached. Her shoulders stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes flicked to the first-class sign as though to confirm it was still there. "Sir," she said, stepping forward, her voice firm but clipped. "This line is for first-class passengers only." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. And it wasn't the words themselves that stung but the tone. The unspoken implication that a man like him didn't belong in this line. Martin didn't flinch. He held out his ticket, his face calm and unreadable. "I know," he replied evenly. She hesitated, as if unsure how to proceed. Her eyes scanned the ticket, lingering on the bold first class printed at the top. But her expression didn't soften. Instead, she frowned. "This must be a mistake," she muttered, her fingers tightening around the ticket. Before Martin could respond, she tore the ticket in two with a deliberate motion, the sound of the paper ripping loud and final. It was a small act, a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken judgments. Around them, the murmurs began. Passengers glanced up from their phones. Their curiosity piqued. Some raised their cameras, the glow of their screens signaling that this moment wouldn't go unnoticed. Martin stood there, staring at the shredded pieces of his ticket in her hand. For a moment, disbelief washed over him. He had experienced prejudice before, countless times in countless forms. But this was new. This was bold. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why did you do that?" The flight attendant met his gaze, her own steady and unrepentant. "You don't belong here," she said simply. "Step aside." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold, cutting deeper than the action itself. Martin felt the familiar sting, not of surprise but of recognition. He had heard these words before, though not always spoken aloud. They echoed in the sideways glances, the closed doors, the quiet refusals that had marked his life. But Martin wasn't the man he once was. The boy who might have lashed out in anger, who might have let the injustice consume him, was gone. In his place stood a man who understood the power of patience, the strength of standing firm. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," he said, his voice unwavering. She laughed lightly, the sound dripping with condescension. "You can take it up with customer service. Now, please step aside." The murmurs grew louder, the crowd around them swelling as more passengers took notice. The flight attendant's confidence faltered under the weight of their stares. But she held her ground. Her arms crossed and her expression defiant. Martin didn't move. He wasn't going anywhere, not out of pride, but because he understood that moments like this mattered. How he responded mattered. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. As the seconds stretched, a young woman in the crowd stepped forward. Her phone raised. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice steady but firm. "What's going on here? Why'd you tear his ticket?" The flight attendant's face flushed, her composure cracking as the attention shifted. She glanced around nervously, her eyes darting from the crowd to Martin and back again. Moments later, a man in uniform appeared, his brisk stride cutting through the tension. He was likely her supervisor, and his expression was a mix of concern and confusion as he took in the scene. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked. Addressing her directly, she opened her mouth to speak, but Martin stepped forward, handing him the torn pieces of his ticket. "This is the problem," he said evenly. "I had a first-class ticket." She tore it up. The supervisor frowned, taking the fragments from Martin's hand. His eyes flicked to the flight attendant, who suddenly looked very small. "Is this true?" he asked her, his tone sharper now. She stammered, the confidence she had moments ago evaporating. "I thought, well, I assumed." Quote. He raised a hand to stop her. "We'll deal with this later," he said firmly, before turning back to Martin. "I apologize for this, sir. Let me get this sorted out for you immediately." But the damage was done. The room buzzed with whispers and camera flashes. People knew what they had seen, and they weren't going to forget it. The flight attendant stood frozen, her earlier bravado replaced by a growing awareness of what she had done. Martin stayed quiet, letting the supervisor handle the logistics of issuing a new ticket. His thoughts were elsewhere, focused not on the moment itself but on what it represented, a microcosm of the battles he had fought his entire life. As he sat in the lounge, waiting for the situation to be resolved, Martin stared at the reissued ticket in his hand. The weight of the moment pressed against him, heavy and unrelenting. He thought about her words, her actions, and the assumptions that had fueled them. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know his story. But she would. And so would everyone else in that room. The lounge was bustling, but to Martin Avery, it felt eerily still. He sat near the large glass window overlooking the tarmac, his reissued first-class ticket resting in his lap. Beyond the glass, planes moved with mechanical precision, their paths clear and deliberate. So unlike the chaotic, unspoken judgments that had just played out at the gate. Around him, passengers whispered in clusters, their curiosity palpable. Some cast fleeting glances his way, while others tried to appear nonchalant as they stole longer looks. He could feel their scrutiny, the weight of their curiosity pressing against him. To them, he wasn't just another traveler anymore. He was the incident. Martin's phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from an old friend. "Saw the video online. You okay?" He frowned, a cold realization settling over him. The moment had already escaped the confines of the airport, carried by the ever-hungry eyes of social media. Strangers were now witnesses, and perhaps commentators, to a story that wasn't theirs to tell. Across the lounge, the flight attendant, the one who had torn his ticket, appeared briefly, speaking hurriedly to her supervisor. Her shoulders slumped, and her expression had shifted from righteous indignation to something resembling fear. Martin noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she gestured toward him. Her words too distant to hear. He didn't feel anger toward her. Not in the way one might expect. What he felt was something deeper, heavier, a mix of weariness and recognition. Her actions had been brash. Yes, but they weren't new. They were a reflection of a system that had taught her, over years and perhaps decades, to make assumptions about men who looked like him. The quiet in Martin's corner of the lounge was broken by a young woman who approached hesitantly, her phone glowing in her hand. She was dressed in casual travel wear, her expression a blend of sympathy and resolve. "Excuse me," she began softly. "I don't mean to intrude, but I wanted to say, what happened back there wasn't right. I recorded part of it, and if you need the video, I can send it to you." Martin looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, He was struck by the quiet courage in her voice. The decision she had made to speak when so many others had remained silent. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but warm. "That means a lot." She nodded, her fingers fidgeting nervously with the edge of her phone case. People need to see things like this. You know, they need to understand that it still happens." He smiled faintly, appreciating her conviction. "They do," he agreed, "but it's not just about seeing. It's about what happens next." She seemed to consider this, her expression thoughtful. "Well," she said after a pause, "I hope you make something good out of it." With that, she walked away, leaving Martin to sit alone with her words lingering in the air. When it came time to board the plane, Martin approached the gate once more. The same supervisor from earlier waiting to escort him personally. The man's demeanor was overly polite, his words spilling out in a rush of apologies and reassurances. "We've taken care of everything, sir," he said, his tone tight with the kind of professionalism that often masked deeper discomfort. "Please accept our sincerest apologies for what happened earlier. It was unacceptable, and we're taking steps to address it internally." Martin nodded, acknowledging the apology without offering much in return. His silence wasn't born of coldness but of calculation. Words, no matter how sincere, could only carry so much weight. He wanted to see what actions would follow. As he stepped onto the plane and made his way to his seat, the absence of the flight attendant was noticeable. Someone else had taken her place. A younger woman with a nervous smile who seemed determined to avoid eye contact. Martin settled into the plush leather seat, the hum of the engines a low vibration beneath him. The other first-class passengers avoided his gaze, their curiosity now cloaked in polite disinterest. The plane taxied onto the runway, and as it climbed into the sky, Martin stared out the window at the disappearing landscape. He thought about the flight attendant's words. "You don't belong here." It wasn't the first time he'd heard those words, and he doubted it would be the last. But this time, they had reached a wider audience. This time, there were witnesses. The hours in the air passed slowly. Martin tried to distract himself with work, but his thoughts kept circling back to the gate. The humiliation, yes, but also the reaction of the people around him. The bystanders, the passengers, the supervisor who had eventually intervened. There was something in their faces that stuck with him. Something that felt like a quiet kind of reckoning. People had seen what happened. They had judged it, but what, if anything, would they do about it? As the plane began its descent, Martin prepared himself for the next step. He knew this wasn't just about one moment at an airport. It was about what that moment represented and the larger systems that allowed it to happen. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. And as the plane touched down on the runway, Martin felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over him. He wasn't just a passenger. He was part of a much bigger journey. The plane hummed steadily as it soared above the clouds. Yet Martin Avery felt the weight of the ground he had left behind. Seated in first class, surrounded by luxury, he was no stranger to the paradox of his position. The seat itself, plush and spacious, was a symbol of achievement. Yet even here, high above the earth, the quiet specter of exclusion lingered. He glanced at the passengers around him. Some avoided eye contact altogether, their faces buried in books or glowing screens. Others cast quick, sidelong glances, as though trying to reconcile his presence in their rarefied space. It was the kind of scrutiny he knew well, one that didn't need words to communicate its meaning. Martin had learned long ago how to navigate these moments. He didn't fidget, he didn't look away, he simply sat, upright and composed, knowing that his existence in such spaces was its own quiet act of defiance. The flight attendant assigned to his section was young, her movements efficient but hesitant. She approached Martin with a tray of beverages, her smile tentative. "Would you care for something to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but strained, as though she feared saying the wrong thing. "Just water, thank you," he replied. She nodded quickly, pouring the water with care before retreating. Martin watched her go, noting the tension in her posture. She wasn't the one who had torn his ticket. That woman was absent, likely reassigned or suspended, but her shadow lingered, an unspoken presence that seemed to ripple through the entire cabin. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, Martin opened his laptop and began reviewing documents for the meeting waiting for him on the other side of this flight. The numbers on the screen blurred, though, as his mind wandered back to the events at the gate. "You don't belong here." The words echoed, sharp and insistent. He had heard them before, in different forms and different places. They were there in the landlord's dismissive tone when he was a young man trying to rent his first apartment. They were there in the skeptical looks of bank managers when he sought loans to start his business. And they were there, unspoken but unmistakable, in the eyes of investors who underestimated him until his success left them no choice but to take him seriously. But this time, the words had been spoken aloud, their sharp edges cutting through the carefully constructed armor he carried with him. The cabin grew quieter as the hours stretched on, the other passengers sinking into the rhythm of the flight. Martin tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept circling back to the incident, not just as an isolated moment but as part of a larger pattern. This wasn't about a single flight attendant or a torn ticket. It was about the gatekeeper mentality, the unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. It was about the countless ways people like him were told, over and over, to prove themselves, even in spaces they had earned access to. A soft chime overhead signaled the return of the flight attendant. She paused at Martin's seat, her expression hesitant. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" she asked. He shook his head, his voice steady. "No, thank you." She lingered for a moment, as though wanting to say more, but then moved on. Martin watched her go, wondering if she felt the tension as acutely as he did. Later, as the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to their destination. Martin stared out the window at the sprawling city below, its lights twinkling like a promise. The flight attendant returned one last time, collecting empty glasses and stray napkins. As she reached Martin's seat, she paused again, her hands clutching the tray tightly. "Sir," she said softly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened earlier. I wasn't there, but I heard about it. It wasn't right." Martin looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't reply immediately, letting her words settle. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. She nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing as she retreated. The plane landed smoothly, the runway lights streaking past the windows in a blur. As the cabin door opened and passengers began to disembark, Martin rose from his seat, gathering his belongings with practiced precision. He walked through the jet bridge, his steps steady and deliberate, his mind already turning toward what lay ahead. Outside the terminal, the cool air greeted him like an old friend. A black car waited for him at the curb, its driver stepping forward to open the door. As Martin settled into the back seat, he glanced at his phone, which buzzed with messages from colleagues and friends. One message stood out, a forwarded email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Gate incident." Martin opened it, his eyes scanning the carefully worded apology from the airline's corporate office. They expressed regret, promised an internal review, and assured him that steps were being taken to prevent future incidents. It was polished, professional, and ultimately hollow. Martin sighed, setting the phone aside. Words were easy, change was hard. As the car pulled away from the curb, he gazed out at the city skyline, its towering buildings a testament to ambition and resilience. He thought about the meeting waiting for him, the deal that could redefine his company's future. But beneath it all, a quieter thought lingered, a reminder that the battle he was fighting wasn't just for himself. It was for everyone who had ever been told, in words or in whispers, that they didn't belong. And as the car moved through the city streets, Martin felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But he was ready for whatever came next. The morning light seeped through the tall glass windows of the high-rise, casting long shadows across the sleek boardroom table. Martin Avery sat at the head, his posture relaxed but his expression focused. Around him, the board members of his company buzzed with conversation, their voices low but filled with energy. They were on the verge of finalizing a deal that would expand the company's reach into untapped markets. A moment years in the making. But Martin's mind wasn't entirely on the numbers or the projections displayed on the screen behind him. The incident at the airport, though resolved on paper, lingered in his thoughts. He had filed no formal complaint yet, nor had he decided how to respond publicly. But something about the silence of those who had witnessed it, and the polished but empty apology from the airline, gnawed at him. One of the board members, a wiry man with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue, cleared his throat. Martin, before we proceed, there's something you should know. Martin looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. Go on. The man gestured toward the laptop in front of him, angling it so Martin could see the screen. There, in glaring detail, was a news headline. First-class discrimination. Airline apologizes after racial incident at gate. Beneath the headline was a blurry video still of Martin at the gate, his calm demeanor juxtaposed with the flight attendant's rigid stance. The article described the incident in detail, pieced together from social media posts and eyewitness accounts. Martin leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing against the walls. I assume this is circulating widely, he said finally, his voice even. The board member nodded. It's gaining traction. The airline issued a statement this morning. But the story is picking up steam. People are talking about what it means. About how things like this still happen. Martin's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He could feel the eyes of the board members on him, their concern palpable. Some looked genuinely worried for him, while others seemed more focused on the potential impact on the company. I've seen the airline's statement, Martin said after a pause. It's a start, but words don't fix systems. Actions do. The meeting moved forward, but the energy in the room felt different. Even as they discussed strategy and projections, Martin sensed an undercurrent of tension. The incident had become a flashpoint, and its ripples were reaching far beyond the airport terminal. After the meeting adjourned, Martin stayed behind, staring out the window at the city below. His assistant entered quietly, placing a folder on the table beside him. This just came in, she said softly. It's the official follow-up from the airline. Martin opened the folder, skimming the contents. The document outlined a series of measures the airline claimed to be implementing: sensitivity training for staff, a review of hiring practices, and a new hotline for customer complaints. It was thorough, but Martin knew better than to take it at face value. They want to meet with you, his assistant added. The CEO himself. They're asking for your input. Martin nodded, his mind already turning. Set it up, but tell them I'm not coming to listen to excuses. I'm going to talk about change. That evening, Martin sat in his office, scrolling through the flood of messages and emails that had poured in since the story broke. Some were from friends and colleagues, offering support. Others were from strangers, sharing their own stories of discrimination and exclusion. One message stood out. It was from a young man who had been at the gate that day. A passenger who had stayed silent during the incident but had now found the courage to speak. I should have said something when I saw what happened. I didn't, and I regret it, but seeing how you handled it inspired me. I'm sorry I didn't stand with you then, but I want you to know that I'm standing with you now. Martin read the message twice, his chest tightening. He had long accepted that silence often followed injustice, but seeing it acknowledged so plainly stirred something in him. He replied simply, "It's never too late to stand up. Thank you." The next morning, Martin arrived at the airline's corporate headquarters. The building was sleek and imposing, a fortress of glass and steel that seemed designed to project power. The CEO met him in the lobby, his handshake firm but his demeanor guarded. "Mr. Avery, thank you for meeting with us," he said, leading Martin into a conference room filled with executives. Their expressions were tense, their postures stiff. Martin took a seat at the head of the table, mirroring the position he had held in his own boardroom the day before. "I'm here because this isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady but sharp. "This is about what your company represents and how it chooses to operate moving forward." The CEO nodded, his expression serious. "We understand that, and we're committed to making meaningful changes." Martin leaned forward, his gaze unflinching. "Commitment isn't enough. Show me the actions you're prepared to take. Show me how you'll ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." The meeting stretched into hours, filled with heated discussions and pointed questions. Martin didn't hold back, challenging the executives to confront the biases embedded in their policies and culture. By the time the meeting ended, an agreement had been reached. The airline would not only implement the measures outlined in their statement but also establish a diversity and inclusion council, with Martin as an advisor. As Martin left the building, he felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The road ahead was long, and the changes they had discussed were only the beginning. But he knew that progress, no matter how incremental, was worth pursuing. And as he stepped into the waiting car, he thought again of the young man's message. The quiet acknowledgement of regret turned into resolve. Change, Martin realized, didn't come all at once. It came in moments, in choices, in the decision to stand up and speak out. Even when it was uncomfortable, even when it felt like no one was listening. The battle wasn't over, but this was a start. The days that followed were heavy with reflection. Martin Avery found himself oscillating between moments of clarity and flashes of anger. The meeting with the airline executives had ended with promises, polished and rehearsed. But promises alone didn't soothe the ache of injustice. Promises didn't erase the memory of standing at the gate, his ticket torn as though his dignity were something disposable. He had spoken his truth in that boardroom, demanded accountability, and seen the flicker of discomfort in their carefully composed faces. Yet, he knew that discomfort was fleeting. Systems as old and deep as this one didn't crumble because of a single meeting. They required a constant, relentless force. Martin sat in his office late one evening, the city lights casting a muted glow through the window. His desk was cluttered with papers and reports. But his focus was elsewhere, on the emails and messages that had flooded his inbox since the incident. Among the supportive notes and words of encouragement, there were stories, dozens of them. Strangers writing to him about the times they had been dismissed, humiliated, or overlooked. A young black man shared how he had been denied a promotion because his manager couldn't see him as a leader. An older woman described being ignored by doctors, her pain dismissed as exaggeration. One message came from a flight attendant who worked for the same airline. She didn't give her name but described the culture she worked in. How biases were ignored. How complaints about discriminatory behavior were dismissed or trivialized. "I want to believe we can do better," she wrote. "But it's hard when the people in charge don't see the problem." Martin read her words twice, a quiet fury building inside him. The gate incident wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom. The next day, Martin attended a press event for his company. It was supposed to be a celebration of the deal they had finalized. A significant expansion that would position them as leaders in their industry. The room was filled with reporters, their questions sharp and probing. At first, the questions were expected. Details about the deal, plans for the future, and projections for growth. But then a reporter in the back stood and asked, "Mr. Avery, would you care to comment on the incident at the airport? It's become a national conversation." The room fell silent, every eye turning to Martin. He could feel the weight of their curiosity, the way they leaned forward just slightly, eager for his response. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Then he spoke. "What happened at that gate wasn't just about me," he began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "It was about the assumptions people make when they look at someone like me. Someone who, in their eyes, doesn't fit the picture of who belongs in first class, or in a boardroom, or anywhere else they deem exclusive." His gaze swept the room, meeting their eyes one by one. "It's not an isolated incident. It's part of a system. A quiet, insidious system that tells people of color, women, and anyone who doesn't fit the mold that they don't belong. And that system thrives because we don't talk about it. We let these moments pass as if they're just bad luck, instead of calling them what they are, barriers." The room was still, the weight of his words pressing against them. "I've been fortunate," he continued. "I've had opportunities, mentors, and resources that allowed me to rise above those barriers. But many people don't, and that's what needs to change." The speech went viral. Clips of Martin speaking circulated across social media, his words sparking a wave of conversation. Some praised his courage, calling him a voice for change. Others dismissed him, accusing him of playing the victim or exploiting the situation for attention. But Martin didn't concern himself with the noise. He focused on the quiet, steady ripples. People who reached out to share their own stories. Employees from other airlines who contacted him to describe the challenges they faced. Young professionals who thanked him for saying what they couldn't. A week later, Martin received a call from the airline's CEO. "I wanted to let you know," the man began, his tone measured, "that we've started implementing the measures we discussed. We're creating a training program for our staff. And we'd like your input." Martin listened, his expression unreadable. The words were promising, but he remained skeptical. Change wasn't about what people said in meetings. It was about what they did when no one was watching. "I'll help," Martin said finally. "But understand this. I'm not here to make you feel better about yourselves. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again." The training sessions began a month later. Martin attended the first one, sitting quietly at the back of the room as airline employees, flight attendants, gate agents, and managers were led through scenarios designed to challenge their biases. Some employees were receptive, their questions thoughtful and engaged. Others resisted, their skepticism evident in their crossed arms and curt responses. During a break, one of the participants approached Martin. She was an older woman, her uniform crisp but her expression weary. "I've been doing this job for 30 years. She said. "I've seen things I didn't like. But I stayed quiet. Now, I'm not sure if I can change the way I see things." Martin looked at her, his voice gentle but firm. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, "but it starts with recognizing the problem. That's the first step. The rest comes with time. And effort." As Martin left the session, he felt a cautious sense of hope. The road ahead was long, and the resistance to change was palpable. But for the first time in weeks, he saw glimpses of progress. Small but significant moments where the system cracked. Just enough to let the light in. And that, he realized, was how all change began. The conference room was cold, sterile in its design, but the tension inside was anything but neutral. Martin Avery sat at the head of the long table, his gaze steady as he listened to the airline executives recount the results of their first diversity training sessions. On the surface, their words painted a picture of progress, employees attending sessions, feedback being gathered, metrics being defined, but beneath the polished language, Martin sensed hesitation, a subtle defensiveness that revealed the depth of the resistance they faced. One of the executives, a middle-aged man with a conservative tie and an air of formality, cleared his throat. "We've had some pushback," he admitted, his tone carefully measured. "A few employees feel targeted. They're saying this training implies they're the problem." Martin leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. "And what's your response to that?" he asked, his voice calm but pointed. The executive hesitated. "We've assured them that the training isn't about blame. It's about awareness. But some still feel uncomfortable." Martin allowed the silence to stretch, watching as the man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then he spoke. "Uncomfortable," he repeated, his tone laced with quiet intensity. "That's an interesting word. Let me tell you what's uncomfortable. Standing at a gate while someone tears up your ticket because they've decided you don't belong. Sitting in a boardroom where every decision you make is second-guessed because of how you look. Walking through a world that reminds you, in ways big and small, that you're an outsider." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. "This training isn't about blame," Martin continued. "It's about holding up a mirror to the systems and behaviors that perpetuate exclusion. And if that makes people uncomfortable, then maybe it's a discomfort we need to sit with." Later that evening, Martin returned to his office, the city skyline stretching out before him in a dazzling display of lights. His assistant entered quietly, a folder in her hand. "This just came in," she said, placing it on his desk. A letter from one of the airline employees. Martin opened the folder, scanning the handwritten letter. The writer, a gate agent who had attended one of the training sessions, expressed a mix of guilt and gratitude. "I didn't realize how much my assumptions affected the way I treat people. It's not something I did intentionally. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. The training was hard to hear. But it made me think in ways I never had before. I want to do better." Martin closed the folder, a flicker of hope breaking through the heaviness of the day. The next week, Martin attended another training session, this time in a different city. The room was filled with employees from all levels: flight attendants, ticket agents, even a few senior managers. The facilitator led them through exercises designed to challenge their assumptions, to confront the quiet biases that shaped their decisions. One exercise involved a series of photographs, passengers of different races, ages, and dress styles. The employees were asked to sort the passengers into categories: first class, business, economy. As Martin watched from the back of the room, he saw the hesitation on their faces. Some were quick to sort, their judgments swift and instinctive. Others paused, their uncertainty revealing the tension between their assumptions and their awareness of being watched. When the facilitator revealed the true identities of the passengers, many of whom defied the stereotypes projected onto them, the room grew quiet. "How did you decide?" the facilitator asked. "What influenced your choices?" One man, a veteran flight attendant, spoke up. "I guess I just went with my gut," he said, "but now I realize my gut isn't as neutral as I thought." As the session ended, Martin lingered, watching as the employees filed out. One woman, a younger gate agent, approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Avery," she began, her voice nervous. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded, offering her a small smile. "Of course." "How do you stay calm?" she asked, her words tumbling out. "When things like what happened to you at the gate happen? How do you keep from getting angry?" Martin considered her question carefully. "I don't avoid anger," he said finally. "I let myself feel it. But I don't let it control me. Anger is a powerful force. It can consume you, or it can fuel you. I've learned to use it as fuel." She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you," she said quietly, before walking away. The backlash continued in the weeks that followed. Employees complained about the training, some calling it unnecessary, others claiming it was unfair. A few even threatened to resign. Martin wasn't surprised. Change was never easy, especially when it required people to confront uncomfortable truths. But he also saw signs of progress. Small, incremental shifts that hinted at something deeper. Employees who had resisted at first began asking questions, engaging in discussions, challenging their own assumptions. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a beginning. One evening, Martin received a message from the CEO of the airline. It was brief but telling. "This is harder than I expected. But I think we're starting to see the impact." Martin replied simply. "Hard is the only way forward. Keep going." The challenges were far from over. Resistance lingered, both overt and subtle, and the path ahead remained uncertain. But as Martin stood in his office, looking out at the city below, he felt a quiet resolve. Change wasn't about grand gestures or immediate results. It was about persistence, about planting seeds and trusting that, given time and effort, they would grow. The battle continued, but so did the progress. The email arrived just past midnight, its tone urgent and its content unsettling. Martin Avery read it twice, his hand tightening slightly on the edge of his desk. It was from a flight attendant, one who had not only witnessed, but silently endured, the discriminatory undercurrents that defined her workplace. "Mr. Avery," she wrote, "I don't know if this will make a difference, but I feel like I need to say it. The training isn't enough. People are going through the motions. But when they think no one's watching, nothing changes. It's like they're waiting for the storm to pass. And for people like me, it feels like we're stuck in the middle of that storm, with no way out." Martin leaned back in his chair, the words sinking into him. He had known this work would be difficult, that change would be slow and uneven. But there was something raw about this message, a sense of urgency that reminded him how high the stakes were. He replied quickly, promising her that her voice mattered and that she wasn't alone. But as he sat in the quiet of his office, surrounded by the city's sleeping skyline, he felt the weight of her words pressing against him. The next day, Martin was scheduled to attend a follow-up meeting with the airline's executive team. The tension in the room was palpable as he entered, the air thick with the unspoken acknowledgement that progress had stalled. The CEO began with an update, his voice carefully neutral. We've completed the first phase of our training program. He said. Participation rates were high, and initial feedback is mixed. Martin raised an eyebrow. Mixed? One of the other executives, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, chimed in. Some employees are resistant, she admitted. They feel like the training is unnecessary, that it's being forced on them. Martin let out a slow breath, his gaze sweeping the room. And what are you doing about that resistance? He asked. The CEO hesitated. We're addressing it, he said finally, but we need to be careful. Pushing too hard could alienate people. Martin's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Let me tell you what alienates people. Being told, day after day, in ways both loud and quiet, that they don't belong. Being made to feel invisible. Or worse, disposable. That's what alienates people. The room fell silent. After the meeting, Martin stayed behind, staring out the window of the conference room. The city below was bustling, alive with the rhythm of countless lives. But all he could think about was the flight attendant's email, her words echoing in his mind. As he stood there, the sharp click of heels approached. It was the no-nonsense executive, her expression unreadable. You were right in there, she said quietly. We're not doing enough. But some people, they're not ready to hear it. Martin turned to face her, his voice steady. If they're not ready, it's because no one's made them ready. Change doesn't wait for people to be comfortable. She nodded slowly, a flicker of respect in her eyes. What do you propose? Accountability, he said simply, not just for the employees, but for the leadership. If people don't see consequences for discriminatory behavior, they'll never take this seriously. The next step was bolder, riskier. Martin knew that pushing for stricter policies and consequences would provoke backlash. Not just from employees, but potentially from within the leadership itself. Yet he also knew that without accountability, the effort would collapse under its own weight. The new policy was announced a week later. It was clear, direct, and uncompromising. Any employee found engaging in discriminatory behavior would face immediate consequences, ranging from mandatory remediation to termination. Leadership would also undergo intensive bias training, with progress reports shared publicly to ensure transparency. The announcement was met with a firestorm of reactions. Some employees applauded the move, grateful to see the company taking a stand. Others, however, bristled, accusing the airline of overreach and creating a culture of fear. One particularly vocal critic was a senior pilot who wrote an op-ed in a national newspaper, accusing the airline of bowing to political correctness and undermining trust among employees. The article gained traction, igniting a fierce debate in the public sphere. Martin expected the backlash, but even he was surprised by its intensity. The airline's social media channels were flooded with comments, some supportive, others seething with anger. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a battle between progress and tradition. Through it all, Martin remained steady. He gave interviews, spoke at public forums, and doubled down on his message. This wasn't about punishing people. It was about creating a culture where everyone felt respected and valued. But the most powerful moments came in private. Emails continued to pour in, not just from airline employees, but from people in other industries who saw their own experiences reflected in the debate. One message came from a young black woman who worked in tech. I've always been the only one who looks like me in the room. I've gotten used to it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Seeing you speak out gives me hope that maybe, one day, I won't have to carry this weight alone. The tipping point came during a town hall meeting with airline employees. The room was packed, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Employees voiced their frustrations, their fears, their hopes. Some were angry, others confused, but amidst the chaos, a quiet voice cut through. It was the flight attendant who had written to Martin. She stood at the back of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. I've worked here for 10 years, she said, and for most of that time, I stayed quiet. I saw things that weren't right, but I didn't think it was my place to speak up. I thought, if I just kept my head down, maybe it wouldn't affect me. But it does. It affects all of us. And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't. The room fell silent, her words sinking in. This isn't about blaming anyone. She continued. It's about making this a better place for everyone. Employees and passengers. And if that makes people uncomfortable, then maybe we need to ask ourselves why. After the town hall, Martin spoke with her privately, thanking her for her courage. I didn't think anyone would listen, she admitted, her voice quiet. They did, Martin said firmly, and so did I. That evening, as Martin reflected on the day, he felt the weight of the work still ahead. But he also felt something else. A sense of momentum. Of cracks forming in the walls that had seemed so immovable. The resistance was real, but so was the progress. And for the first time in weeks, Martin allowed himself to believe that real change was possible. The culmination of months of conflict and effort arrived on a cold, bright morning. Martin Avery stood in front of the airline's corporate headquarters, staring up at the glass facade. It was a building designed to project success. But its sleek exterior now carried the weight of scrutiny. Change was no longer a concept hovering in boardrooms, it was a demand echoed by employees, customers, and the public. Today, Martin would see if that demand had been heard. Inside, a press conference was being prepared. Cameras lined the back wall of the room, and reporters whispered to one another as they waited. At the center of the stage sat the CEO and key executives, their expressions serious but composed. Martin was seated beside them, his presence a statement in itself. As the event began, the CEO stepped to the podium. His speech was carefully crafted, filled with acknowledgments of past failures and promises for a better future. He detailed the steps the airline had taken, new policies, training programs, accountability measures. But the moment that caught the room's attention came when he spoke about Martin. Mr. Avery has been instrumental in guiding us through this process, the CEO said, his voice steady but somber. He reminded us that change requires more than words. It requires courage, persistence, and accountability. We are grateful for his leadership and his unyielding commitment to justice. Martin didn't smile at the praise. Instead, he listened intently, his hands resting lightly on the table. He knew that words could inspire, but they were not the end goal. Action was. After the CEO finished, it was Martin's turn to speak. He rose slowly, taking his place at the podium. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. This isn't about me, he began, his voice calm but firm. It's about all the people who have ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they don't belong. It's about the systems that allow those messages to persist, unchallenged, for far too long. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I've seen progress here, he continued. I've seen people confront their biases, engage in difficult conversations, and take steps toward real change. But let me be clear, this is only the beginning. The work doesn't end because we've issued statements or created policies. The work ends when no one has to fight for their dignity at a gate, or a boardroom, or anywhere else. The room erupted in applause. But Martin remained composed, his mind already turning to what lay ahead. The weeks following the press conference marked a turning point. The airline began rolling out new initiatives with greater transparency, sharing progress reports with employees and customers alike. Stories of change began to surface. Gate agents who stopped second-guessing passengers based on appearances. Managers who intervened when microaggressions arose. Employees who found the courage to speak out against long-standing inequities. But change was never seamless. There were still missteps, moments when old habits resurfaced, and pockets of resistance that refused to fade quietly. Martin knew this all too well. One afternoon, he received an email from the flight attendant who had torn his ticket months earlier. She had been terminated after the incident, but her message carried a tone he hadn't expected. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I did, she wrote. I was wrong, more wrong than I even realized at the time. I know I can't undo it, but I want to learn how to do better. If you're willing, I'd like to talk. Martin stared at the email for a long moment. His emotions conflicted. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but he believed in accountability as a pathway to growth. He replied with a single line. Let's talk. Their meeting took place in a quiet cafe, far from the glare of cameras and headlines. She looked nervous, her hands clutching her coffee cup tightly. I've been thinking about that day ever since it happened, she said, her voice trembling slightly. At first, I was angry. Angry at you. Angry at the airline. Angry at everyone but myself. But then I started to see, it wasn't just about that moment. It was about everything I'd been taught. Everything I'd absorbed without even realizing it. Martin listened, his expression unreadable. And now? He asked. Now I want to change. She said simply. I don't want to be that person anymore. Martin nodded slowly. Change is hard, he said, but if you're willing to do the work, it's possible. As the months turned into a year, Martin continued his work with the airline and beyond. The incident at the gate had become a case study in corporate accountability, inspiring similar initiatives in other industries. But for Martin, the most meaningful moments came in the form of quiet victories. Emails from employees who felt seen for the first time. Messages from passengers who noticed a difference in how they were treated. Stories of individuals who had found their voices. One day, as he boarded a flight, a gate agent greeted him warmly. Her smile genuine. Mr. Avery, she said, handing him his ticket. Thank you for what you've done. It's making a difference. Martin took the ticket, his own smile small but sincere. It's all of us, he said simply. As the plane soared into the sky, Martin gazed out the window at the clouds below. The work wasn't finished. It never would be. But for the first time, he felt a sense of possibility. A belief that the world could be made better. One step at a time. And that, he realized, was enough to keep going.